Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. As always, I'm having some really bizarre technical difficulties. It just wouldn't be a podcast without that, I guess. Not to mention the cats. Anywho, tonight I'm going to be talking about my favorite all-time TV show, Kolchak, the Night Stalker. Way back in the 1960s and 70s, there were somewhat, as in a whole lot, limited in what we could watch on TV. Only had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Cable TV came along, and suddenly there were like a dozen channels, and then even more. But still, most of what we could watch was governed by the big 3, who had their ideas on what people should and could watch. There were shows like Mission Impossible, which was from 1966 until 1973. Action and drama, but nothing science fiction or paranormal. McCloud was a police drama about a New Mexico deputy marshal reassigned to New York City. It ran from 1970 to 77. They did kind of have a paranormal show when murder victims were found drained of blood. It was a cool idea, but, well, the authorities began to believe that an elderly star who used to be in a lot of vampire movies, Lorraine Velasco, played by John Carradine, was suspected of believing he was a vampire and somehow running around sucking blood out of people. How can such a small cat be so noisy? Anyway, it kind of had the whole Scooby-Doo ending. Pull the mask off. Let's see who it is. It seemed as if just about every show on TV worth watching was some kind of a police drama. Movies that finally made it to the home screen were chopped up to remove anything nasty or entertaining. And they were pregnant with commercials. The closer to the finale you got, the more commercials there were. Some movies were so badly chopped to make them acceptable for TV audience, they made very little sense. We did have Star Trek first hitting the small screen back in 1966. It was more science than science fiction. Oh yeah, they had aliens and giant spacecraft and things, but they still kind of followed the science-y kind of formula. Night Gallery was cool. Rod Serling, when he had finished up doing Twilight Zone, began the Night Gallery from 1969 to 73. It was scary and entertaining. I watched just about every show, and I lost a lot of sleep as a result of it. See if any of y'all recognize this. Do you know what grows from old ladies' fingers? That was from one of the episodes. Just a brief step back in time, we had a TV show that was like no other show ever. Dark Shadows was an American Gothic soap opera. that was on weekdays from June 27th, 1966 until April 2nd, 1971. Soap operas got their name from being on during the daytime, and they were mostly sponsored by soap companies, geared towards the American housewife who might get a little bored sitting around the house and decide to watch TV. As far as I'm concerned, soap operas were not worth watching except for Dark Shadows. The show depicted the lives, loves, trials, and tribulations of a wealthy Collins family who lived in Collinsport, Maine. Unlike any other TV soap opera going, there were supernatural things being portrayed. The first episode was about Victoria Winters, who had spent her life in an orphanage, never knowing the identity of her parents. She is offered a position as a governess to a young boy living in Collinsport. Hoping to learn more about her own mysterious past, Vicky travels to the small fishing village. When she stops in at a coffee shop, the waitress warns her she shouldn't be hanging around the Collins family. Meanwhile, Burke Devlin returns to Collinsport after a long absence, and he meets with a detective named Wilbur Strake, whom he had hired to investigate the residents, specifically Victoria's new employer, who own half the town, and they're considered somewhat eccentric. In order to watch the show, we had to run home from school and hope our mother would let us watch TV instead of staying outside in the fresh air and sunshine. If it was raining, we had a fairly good chance of catching the show. We always missed the beginning because it was on so darn early. You had to kind of come in the middle and try and figure out what was going on. The series became far more popular when vampire Barnabas Collins, played by Jonathan Freed, was introduced about 10 months into the show. The show was chock full of paranormal beings from ghosts, werewolves, zombies, man-made monsters, witches, warlocks, time travel, and parallel universe. They had a very small budget, and a lot of the actors would play more than one part. Lots of makeup, a change of costumes. Hopefully nobody will notice. They also tended to use a lot of props that were free, so therefore they weren't very good. But hey, the show was so different, a lot of people decided to watch it. By 1969, it had become the highest rated daytime series. So what did the networks do? Cancel it. The original network run of the show amassed 1,225 episodes, seeing as it was on 5 times a week. The success of the series spawned a media franchise that included 2 feature films, House of Dark Shadows in 1970 and Night of Dark Shadows in 1971. There was a series of comic books that featured all the different cast characters, but the most popular, of course, were any that depicted Barnabas. He was the most favorite character in the show. They tried a 1991 TV remake, which failed. They tried a 2004 remake, which failed. And then in 2012, they tried it once more, and it failed. You wonder about those folks out in Hollywood. Why do they keep trying to reinvent the wheel? And yet they do. Hollywood has the idea that they know what everybody wants to see. They had a highly popular TV show, but they didn't make any other paranormal shows at the time. It was considered uncool. Nobody really wants to watch that, even though they had the highest ratings on TV. The Prisoner was a 1967, hard to say what it was. If you haven't seen The Prisoner, well, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a spy show. It wasn't a mystery, even though there was a huge mystery involved. Patrick McGowan was the star of a TV show called The Secret Agent Man. In The Prisoner, it starts out with him resigning from some agency in England. He gets kidnapped and he winds up on an island run by someone who wants information. If you've never seen it, you can catch all the hard to understand bits on YouTube. A warning, it might make your head hurt. Just when you think you know what's going on, you find out you don't. But it was still interesting to watch. William Lyle Richardson was born in Spokane, Washington, May 7th, 1922. When he was 11 years old, his folks got a divorce and custody was given to his dad, who was a traveling salesman for a chemical company. When William was an adolescent, his father sent him to live with a family that had a farm on Puget Sound near Tacoma, while his dad was away working. Any kid living on a farm was expected to work, and work hard. My dad grew up on a farm, and he had a lot to say about working hard. He had a lot to say about other things too, but oh well. When Bill decided he'd had enough of this working hard on the farm, he ran away and he moved in with a Native American family on the Nisqually River. His father found out where he was and he got Bill sent to a Catholic boarding school. Oh, boy. If Bill thought the farm was bad, well, this was a lot worse. At about age 16, he left the boarding school and he went to live under a wharf in San Francisco before moving in with his mother and stepfather at a ranch that they owned in Southern California. Well, it looks as if his dad decided that Bill living with his mother was a lot better than him running around the country trying to avoid the authorities, and so he let him stay there. While attending high school in California, Bill developed aspirations to be an architect. And after graduating, he enrolled at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. At some point in his studies, he began looking into acting. This led to his moving from California to New York. He studied theater at the HB Studio in New York City. Bill was rejected from military service because he had really bad knees. New York could only hold him for so long before Bill headed back west. While attending the University of the Pacific, Bill took a side job building scenery for a local theater group. He dropped out of college and found work as a painter at the Columbia Pictures movie studio in 1945. When an opening came up available for a small part in a movie called A Song to Remember, Bill applied and was given his first movie role. In New York, you have stage actors, and in California, you had screen actors. You might wonder why the two are so far apart. December 18th, 1908, Edison assembled representatives of the nation's movie companies, Biograph, Vitagraph, American Mutoscope, and all the others. He invited them, well, it was more like he ordered them, to sign a monopolistic peace treaty. Since 1891, when Edison filed his first patent on a motion picture camera and film system, his lawyers had launched 33 infringement suits against other production outfits. Now, they weren't able to win all of these lawsuits, but it didn't stop them from filing the things. It caused these production companies to just about go bankrupt since they couldn't afford all the legal fees. Edison kind of had an unlimited amount of money. These other companies didn't, so he almost always won, whether he won in court or not. His victims all agreed Victims, his invited guests, victims, all agreed to sign this contract with the Edison movie empire. The patent company created a subsidiary called the General Film Exchange that their sole purpose was to enforce the rules and collect money from these companies. General Film Exchange set up a strict procedure for collection and distribution. Mondays, its administrators would buy a predetermined number of films from the companies. They had to have a new film each week. It was in their contract. On Wednesdays, they would purchase more films from another group. Each of these companies had to have a new film out every week, whether it was any good or not. The compliant trade press told exhibitors, movie houses, what releases would be available and when. Movie house owners could not choose among these films, especially if they were in a small town. They also couldn't hold films over that were popular. They were forced to take what they could get, even if the film was horrible. Some had little to no story, just people doing things on the big screen. General Films didn't allow for extraordinarily popular films by buying extra copies, since an expensive production sold for the same price as a cheaper one. Being a monopoly, Edison's company had no reason to improve or change how they did business. A German immigrant, Karl Lemley, worked at whatever job he could find to put food on the table at home. One day, he wandered into a Chicago Nickelodeon and he found a new purpose in life. Nickelodeons were the first type of indoor exhibition spaces dedicated to showing motion pictures, and they got their name from the cost of getting in, a nickel, and the ancient Greek word odeon, which refers to a roofed-over theater. Carl Laemmle opened his own theater. He had his entire family working to make the place function. As profits grew, he opened a second theater. Well, the Edison Company wasn't renting him enough movies to keep up with public demand. Chicago was far from New York, and Edison's company gave them little priority when it came to movies. Thinking ahead, Carl bought his own film and equipment and started making his own movies. He also began enticing actors away from Edison by offering them much better contracts. Edison considered actors a dime a dozen, and any actor had to not only compete with every actor out on the street, but anybody that thought they were an actor. You could just walk in and say, yeah, I want to be in a movie, and the chances were Edison's company would hire you. So the bigger names started moving over to Laemmle instead. Edison hired what he called detectives, better known as stooges, to visit movie studios and search for any violations of film patents. Anyone who refused to cooperate would find their production company being trashed. Did you see the movie The Prestige? A magician hires Nikola Tesla to build him a magic cabinet. Tesla builds the device but is moving away from Colorado to get away from certain people. A couple of guys show up, and the next thing you know, Tesla's laboratory is a flaming mess. Those would have been the detectives working for Edison. Edison didn't like Tesla. Cameramen discovered the best way to handle these goons was to have several cameras on hand. When the goons showed up, the cameramen would quickly hide away any Edison equipment and grab things that were not covered by his patents. Edison had a habit of stealing other people's ideas and getting them patented through some less than honorable means. On many occasions, he managed to get the patent office before the actual inventor. Carl Laemmle was being hounded by Edison's goons, so he decided to move his film company as far from New York as he could get. Los Angeles, California was just a small town at the time, so Lemley moved his independent studio there. Getting back to the story, at some point in his acting career, William Lyle Richardson changed his name to Darren McGavin. Shortly after his first movie role, McGavin moved back to New York and he studied at the neighborhood playhouse and the Actors Studio. 1949, he joined the cast of a touring production of The Death of a Salesman playing Happy Lowman, something like that. He began appearing on Broadway 1954 in productions of My Three Angels and The Rainmaker. While in New York, McGavin also appeared on several live theater programs that aired on television, such as the Kraft Television Theater and the U.S. Steel Hour. McGavin returned to Hollywood in early 1950s and appeared in the short film A Word to Wives with Marsha Hunt, and had his first starring role in a feature film called Summertime, opposite Katharine Hepburn. The Man with the Golden Arm was filmed in 1955 also. McGavin appeared twice in the anthology series Alfred Hitchcock Presents. First in the episode titled Tigers in Leash, and later in Cheney Vase. He was a scheming caretaker and aspiring art thief. He was opposite Carolyn Jones. He also appeared in the Alfred Hitchcock Hour titled The Matter of Murder. Some of you will recognize the name Carolyn Jones, as she played Morticia Addams in the TV series The Addams Family. She was also in The House of Wax with Vincent Price, but you might not recognize her with blonde hair. McGavin was in the TV show The Man from U.N.C.L.E. in 1964. He was in The Deadly Quest Affair, where he played Victor Carmack. If you never watched The Man from U.N.C.L.E., well, it was a cool show. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was an American spy fiction television series produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and it was on NBC. Now, this series followed secret agents, played by Robert Vaughn and David McCallum, who worked for a secret international counter-espionage and law enforcement agency called UNCLE. This series was premiered on September 22, 1964, and it ran until '68. Jeff Rice is best known as being the author of the Kolchak Papers, a novel he finished on October 31st, yes, Halloween, 1970. Rice's novel was still unpublished when it was optioned for a television, and it was adopted for a TV movie called The Night Stalker. I'm not going to tell all the details of these shows. I'll give enough to hopefully entice those of you that have never seen the movie or the TV shows to look into it. You can find a lot of them on YouTube. If you have seen the show, I hope these short scenarios make you relive some of your past life, watching one of the better TV shows ever made. 1971, McGavin landed the role that a lot of us remember him for today. He was the cynical reporter Carl Kolchak in a low-budget horror thriller, The Night Stalker, which was filmed in 1972. It's about a vampire running amok in Las Vegas. Barry Atwater, who played Jonas Skorzeny, had few, well, as in no lines at all. The only sounds he made was growling and screaming. I'll bet his script was pretty short. At first, Kolchak is saying things like, "This nut thinks he's a vampire." At the prodding from his girlfriend, Gail Foster, who's played by Carol Lindley, Kolchak begins looking into vampires. In the book, uh, Gail Foster was actually a woman of negotiable affections. But in the series, because it was a TV movie, they made her into a cocktail hostess. Anyway, at the prodding of his girlfriend, Kolchak begins reading up on vampires. And then his friend and FBI connection, Bernie Jinks, which is played by Ralph Meeker, does some homework of his own and he discovers Scorsese's background. It turns out the guy has been in hiding in the U.S. for a long time, like since World War II. Kolchak begins to believe that maybe this man really is a vampire. He tries to convince the authorities that they need to arm their men with crosses and wooden stakes. Now, the folks in Hollywood didn't do their homework. They simply went with what all the other movie folks said was the way to kill a vampire. The stake is not to kill a vampire, but it's to hold him down to the ground while you cut their head off. And then, once you've cut their head off, they might still be alive. So, what you had to do was take their head, place it backwards between their feet, and then rebury the body. That way, the vampire wouldn't be able to get back up out of his grave. Speaking of finding his head, the specter is a headless spirit that is searching for the missing top part of his body. This comes up later in episode 15, The Chopper, in the series Kolchak, the Night Stalker. The made-for-TV movie was a monster ratings. It was the highest rated television movie for 1972. The scriptwriters were soon hard at work with a sequel. The Night Strangler came out in 1973. Kolchak has been traveling looking for work. No newspaper will hire him since he was thrown out of Las Vegas, and he winds up in Seattle, Washington, in a bar. Vincenzo, his boss from Las Vegas, has walked into the bar, and who does he wind up running into but his old nemesis and good friend, Kolchak. Well, Vincenzo has a soft spot for this guy, and so he arranges for Kolchak to meet Llewellyn Crossbinder, once again played by John Carradine, who is the owner of the newspaper that eventually winds up hiring Kolchak. John Carradine was a famous horror actor back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, starring in such classics as Billy the Kid versus Dracula, and The Blood of Dracula's Castle, and Dr. Dracula, and House of Dracula, and The Vampire Hookers. He was also Herman Munster's boss on the TV show The Munsters. Carl is assigned to look into a three-day-old murder. It looks as if it was painful for Vincenzo to hand the assignment over to his old friend. As Kolchak makes his rounds, mostly bothering people who didn't want to talk to him, the murderer strikes again. Kolchak is looking for a connection to the Las Vegas vampire murders. He discovers the vampires are all being strangled, and a small amount of blood is missing. There's a needle puncture that is found in the base of the skull, and their necks have been crushed, not just strangled. A lot of scenes were where anything bad was going to happen. The lighting is very low, and a lot of people complained about it. Well, you can't see what's going on. Well, that was the whole idea. The directors wanted you to watch the show and kind of fill in all the blanks with your own imagination, which is what a lot of us do. Makes it a lot more creepy, a lot more interesting. Kind of like with Jaws, you hear the music and you know something bad is going to happen. Titus Barry, played by Wally Cox, is the archivist of the newspaper. He digs up some interesting stories from years ago, all taking place in Pioneer Square all connected to the Strangler. Few people will know this, but the area wasn't called Pioneer Square until 1970. Before that, it was called Skid Row. Skid Row comes from logging towns. The logs were drug or skidded along an open area. People who lived nearby were amongst the poorest of the poor, and thus the name Skid Row. It wasn't a pleasant place to live. Well, Barry discovers that in 1952 there were 6 murders that all took place in the same location and with similar details to what Kolchak is now looking into. He digs back farther and he finds 6 more murders from 1931, and then they find more murders from 1910 and 1889, every 21 years. During the show, the story of the Seattle Underground comes out. Kolchak and his new girlfriend, Lois Harper, take a tour of the tunnels that run under the streets. Well, after watching the show, I had to find out, was there really tunnels under the Seattle? And boy, was I surprised to discover that there were. The town had I believe it burnt down or something, and the city just rebuilt on top of the rubble. This was before computers, and so in order to find out anything, you had to look it up in books. You had to go to the library and dig. You had to use the Dewey Decimal System and the card catalog, things that don't exist today. I was very disappointed when I found out that these tunnels and buildings under the ground were nothing like what they showed on TV, but still, for the TV show, it was pretty cool. Kolchak and his current love interest, Lois, who is a belly dancing college student, run into Al Lewis, who was Grandpa from the Munsters. He's playing a wino living in one of the tunnels. Seeking more information on his nemesis, Kolchak goes to the university to speak to Professor Crabwell, who looks an awful lot like the Wicked Witch of the West, because she was. Margaret Hamilton had a huge part in The Wizard of Oz. Remember the flying monkeys? She had a small part in The Night Strangler, but she did a really good job portraying a cranky college professor. She tells Kolchak about the elixir of life. Way back in the Dark Ages, and even after that, the elixir of life was also known as the elixir of immortality. It was a potion that was supposed to grant the drinker eternal life and eternal youth. This elixir was also said to cure all diseases. Alchemists in various ages and cultures sought the means of formulating this elixir. Various ingredients were tried, including human blood. The murderer was a 144-year-old doctor who was seeking immortality, and he was crazy. At the conclusion of the movie, Kolchak, Vincenzo, and Lewis all get run out of Seattle. And now they are en route to New York City, where they're looking for their next adventure. A third movie was already being planned that was going to be called The Night Killer. TV movie number 3 was to take place in New York. Now, Jonas Scorsese had somehow come back from the dead, which, considering he was undead, is quite a trick. All of his victims' bodies had been cremated, but they never said what happened to Scorsese after Carl had pounded that stake into his chest. He somehow escapes Las Vegas and he moves to the Big Apple. Kolchak and Vincenzo wind up working at some newspaper in New York just in time to discover bodies are showing up all drained of blood. Well, that was the third movie supposed to be. Instead of another movie, the network decided to make The Night Stalker into a series. After some negotiation, McGavin agreed to return as Kolchak and also to serve as the series' executive producer. though he was not credited or paid for this extra work. Neither NBC nor Universal had bothered to obtain Jeff Rice's permission to turn the book into a weekly series. The original agreement had been only the 2 movies. To add to the problem, the studios didn't see it necessary to credit Rice as the originator of the main character. Rice sued the studios. The suit was resolved shortly before the series aired in 1974, replacing a show called Toma on the network's Friday night schedule. Rice did receive on-screen credit as the series creator. The first 4 episodes aired under the title The Night Stalker, and then after about a month-long pause, the series was renamed and returned as Kolchak, The Night Stalker. Because of this, it has led to some confusion when people are searching for the show. The second television movie, The Night Strangler, was turned into a novel by Jeff Rice, and he had based his new book on Richard Matheson's screenplay. I've read both books. I found them entertaining, but if you're hoping to read about Carl Kolchak as seen on TV, the books are a lot different. I would still recommend reading them. It's just keep in mind it's not going to be the same guy. You watch the show because of Kolchak. Everything else going on was just there. In the books, he's a totally different person. Well, the Night Stalker series began with Kolchak telling about what had happened in Chicago. He says, now try to imagine that I sound like Darren McGavin while I'm reading this. I was going to use a sound bite from the TV show, but then I got to thinking about copyright laws, and I figured I didn't want to get deplatformed from YouTube. So listen to Darren McGavin's voice. If by chance you happen to be in the Windy City between May 28th and June 2nd of this year, you would have had a very good reason to be terrified. During this period, Chicago was being stalked by a horror so frightening, so fascinating, that it ranks with the great mysteries of all times. It's been the fictional subject of novels, plays, films, even an opera. Now, here are the true facts. May 21st, what's that 21st? 21st, 3 a.m. Across the state line in Warner's Boom Boom Room in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Michelle Schiffler, dancer, whatever, had just done her last number. And I mean really her last number. Well, the following morning finds Carl Kolchak in his boss's office, Tony Vincenzo. The two are discussing Carl's conduct during his coverage of a bank robbery. At the scene, Carl acted as if he were the commissioner of police, placing several citizens under arrest and commandeering a private vehicle. In doing so, he severely damaged the relationship between the Independent News Service and the Chicago Police Department. To punish him, Vincenzo assigns him the task of writing the advice column, substituting for Miss Emily, who is on vacation. And now at this time, you never saw Miss Emily. She hadn't actually been cast as a member of the crew, but they keep referring back to her. So Carl now has to fill in for Miss Emily, reading all of these letters, asking for advice, and then typing up a response to each and every one. Among the many bizarre letters is one from a reader complaining about a strange man in Wilton Park who dresses in a really bizarre costume, and he only goes out at night. The writer believes that this guy has X-ray vision, and he's watching her watching him. During an encounter with the murderer, there are lots of gunshots, kind of like Chicago is today. The killer runs away unharmed. It's kind of an ongoing theme on most Kolchak movies. Lots of shootings and the creature just running off. I like the dark room on the show. They used the corner of the men's room to develop film. It added a lot to the seediness of that particular newspaper. Their office is right next to the elevated train, which runs right by the window every so often, and you can hear it rattling all the windows. A real nice place to work. A reporter from another paper, Mrs. Plum, no, it's Miss Plum, is also working the same story, only she is getting letters from the killer. As she offers to meet with the Ripper, as he is called. Everybody keeps describing her as being fat. Uh, Beatrice Collin was not fat. She was a bit round, but she wasn't fat. She wasn't skin and bones either. But everybody describes her as being fat, which, well, she wasn't. Well, she has been contacted by the Ripper, and he's offered to meet with her, and he promises not to kill anyone. You know, somebody that murders people, yeah, you can really trust them. Well, Kolchak finds out that Plum is meeting the Ripper near Wilton Park. Now, this brings back a letter that he had read but not paid attention to. So he dashes into Vincenzo's office and starts digging through all the letters, trying to find that one letter from Wilton Park. He contacts the writer. Well, he goes to her apartment, a Miss Agenweller, who tells him that just that night the Ripper, well, this strange man with X-ray eyes, has met with a fat girl in the park. Carl begins to think that maybe this is Miss Plum. Ruth McDevitt first appeared in the series as a nosy neighbor who wrote to Miss Emily all the time. She was cast as Miss Emily in episode number 9, The Spanish Moss Murders. As she's constantly asking Kolchak for advice, once she begins laying out the weekly crossword puzzle as well. She asks for things like, Carl, how do you spell executioner or some such? The crossword puzzles must have been something to read back then. So the woman who played the nosy neighbor in the first episode turns out to be Miss Emily in the 9th episode. Carl begins investigating what this woman has told him, and he discovers that there's an old, nasty, horrible, rotten house where this man with X-ray eyes is living. He runs to an electric supply company and he gets some supplies, and then he returns. Well, he gains entrance to the guy's house by breaking a window. Well, that was Carl. You'd have to understand the character. He gets inside this old house, and I kind of wonder why the nosy neighbor didn't say anything about his breaking the window. Well, due to the way Carl deals with the Ripper, the house catches on fire and all the evidence is burned up. All he has for evidence of the case is one shoe that was made in England 70 years ago. And other than that, everything is gone, so he can't prove what he knows is real. That's kind of the way Kolchak goes in every episode. Episode number 2 was called The Zombie. Carol Ann Susie was an actress whose career spanned 40 years, but she's best known for her first and last acting performance. She plays the part of Monique Marmelston. Carol Ann owed her career to Darren McGavin after he met her in a restaurant. As she was working as a waitress, and McGavin decided that she would add something to the series. Being the executive producer, he hired her to play the part of his bumbling intern. The show starts out with Kolchak telling us about a bizarre set of murders. Once again, this is Kolchak's voice, or Darren McGavin's voice. Popular folklore would have us believe that there exists in the underworld ruthless men who fear nothing. This story should debunk that myth. August 14th, 2 a.m. While the upper strata of the syndicate were accustomed to dealing in millions, the foundation of their fortune was here in their counting houses, in the small change of the numbers racket. Mr. Albert Berg, head collections man, a graduate of an Ivy League business school, he was an incompetent even by the syndicate standards. About the only smart thing he'd ever done was marry the boss's sister. Willie Pike, he'd never been convicted of anything by anyone except the boxing commission. Willie took a dive into the canvas and on through into the bulletproof car set. Willie was making a bundle he would never get to spend. The doors are ripped open and the killer enters the picture. You only see him from the back. The police report claims that Willie Pike died by being severely beaten. It looked like a gangland killing. Now, Carl arrives early and is banging out a story when an overturned cup of coffee heralds the arrival of Monique Marmelston. Tony Vincenzo comes to visit Carl's desk, and he tells Carl that he wants to take him to a restaurant for some coffee in Danish. Carl remembers the last time this happened, he wound up covering a hardware convention in Sioux Falls. Then Tony calls him a co-worker. And Carl remembers the last time he heard that word. He spent 3 days rewriting obituaries because the obituary writer was out drunk. Tony offers Carl an exclusive, a police raid at a syndicate burial ground. But then he tells Carl Kolchak that he has to take Monique under his wing to teach her the finer aspects of being a reporter. Well, Kolchak is Vincenzo's biggest headache, but he also considers him his best reporter. He always gets the story, whether it's believable or not. Then he tells Kolchak that Abe Marbleston is the executive at the New York INS office. So, Kolchak has no choice in the matter. He has to take the boss's daughter, or the boss's niece, with him and try to teach her how to be a reporter. Well, the police have surrounded the location where these men are hiding, the Russo brothers. They demand the brothers surrender, and to which the Russo brothers begin shooting from the front of the building. All kinds of machine gun fire and handgun fire. So the police return fire. Kolchak comes skidding to a halt, and as soon as the car is stopped, Monique jumps out of the car, runs up to the police line to get photographs. Well, Carl, not wanting her to get killed, even though he doesn't like her, grabs her and drags her back to the trunk of his car. And he convinces her that if she would stand up in the back of the trunk, she would be able to get some better photographs. As soon as Monique is standing up in the trunk of his car, he pushes her head down and slams the lid. She winds up spending the rest of the day locked in his trunk. Well, he's constantly doing things like that to Monique, and he just constantly gets away with it because that's what kind of guy he is. Well, the men inside the building that the police have been shooting at suddenly stop shooting. When the police go in to see why, they discover they are both dead with their backs broken. They also discover that there's a third body in the room with them who has not had his back broken, but he's been shot, but not by the guns that any of the police are carrying. I think they said they were 44 Magnums, but I'm not going to swear to it, and the police were using 38s. Well, it turns out that this guy had already been buried once, and now the authorities are going to bury him a second time. I think they wind up burying him a third time, too. Kolchak is saddled with Monique, who, no matter what, he can't get rid of her. After finding a few more dead bodies, complements of the zombie, which Monique manages to get real close to, Carl puts her in a cab and tells the driver to take her to Brooklyn. And away she goes for a while. After seeing how to kill a zombie, we gathered together, that's me and the guys I hung out with, we gathered together as many white candles as we could find. We got needles and thread and salt, just in case we ever needed it. Now, that's the kind of guys I hung out with. We had our own emergency supplies for things like this. The third episode was called They Have Been, They Are, and They Will Be. It's about a UFO landing in Chicago, and an invisible alien is running around killing animals and people. After Kolchak's usual introduction to the show, you should be able to notice Monique is sitting at the desk right behind him. She somehow got back from New York. Well, even after all the nasty things he's done for her, she's still trying to work with the man. The show kind of touches all bases. There are government men who show up and remove any evidence. There's a guy trying to communicate with the aliens who winds up dead. Anytime you see any kind of a higher up in the police department, you know this person is not going to be nice to Carl. Mostly sheriffs, captains, lieutenants, people like that are willing to do anything, including having Carl arrested, to try to keep him away from the story. The part of these officials were played by celebrity actors that would make a one-time appearance on the show. Actors like Keenan Wynn, who played Captain Joe Mad Dog Siska, or William Daniels, who played Lieutenant Jack Mateo. Larry Linvale was Captain Jonas, but he had also played the medical examiner, Dr. Mukherjee, in the first movie, The Night Stalker. The most notable police official, Nemesis, was Kathy Brown, who played Lieutenant Irene Lamont in episode number 20, The Sentry. What makes her so notable was she was actually Darren McGavin's wife at the time. His being the executive producer, I guess he decided it would be a good idea to have a little more income for the family. Darren McGavin created Kolchak based on many reporters that he'd seen and talked to while he was living in New York. The original character was a big guy who wore Hawaiian shirts and drank a lot. McGavin didn't think this is what the lead role called for, so he reworked the script, making Kolchak far more abrasive, nosy, and sneaky than the directors or the writers thought he should have been. Kolchak was a bumbling, loudmouth, less than heroic person that you really shouldn't like, but he always managed to do the right thing and save the day. His suit was supposed to look like he was wearing it the day he got run out of New York, and he never bothered to update his wardrobe. In the movies, Kolchak was wearing white patent leather shoes, but McGavin decided Kolchak should be wearing tennis shoes because that's how the reporters in New York had dressed while he was living there. Having recreated the character, McGavin would argue with the directors and the writers anytime they wanted a scene to go a way he didn't think Kolchak would have done things. This led to many arguments that sometimes nearly came to fistfights. People would yell back and forth. Eventually one or the other, and sometimes both, would storm off the set, bringing filming to a standstill. Episode number 4 was a rework of the previous movie plot that had been set in New York. Kolchak had been run out of Seattle after dealing with Dr. Richard Malcolm, the Night Strangler. Vincenzo has also been thrown out of the city and was now looking for someplace new to work as an editor. Skorzeny somehow came back from the dead, which, considering he's undead, is quite a trick. He's moved to New York and was busy killing off the population when who should show up but Carl Kolchak. The movie was only in the planning stage when the Night Stalker TV series was given the go ahead. The script was shelved until number 4 episode, where it was reworked to take place in LA, and the vampire was to be a woman of negotiable affections. After Kolchak put a stake through the heart of vampire Jonas Scorzani, he and all of his victims had been cremated. That was thought to have put an end to his line of creations. One victim, a call girl named Catherine Rollins, was not found until a road crew unknowingly frees her from her burial site, her grave. Uh, they dug her up by accident. Anyway, so she resumes her career, but instead of turning tricks, she lures unsuspecting men into unknown locations and sucks them dry of blood and money. So, well, Kolchak gets sent out to LA by Vincenzo with orders to interview a guru that is very popular at the time. Being uninterested in talking to or writing about some Hindu celebrity, he winds up missing the scheduled interview. In order to give Vincenzo the story that he wants, Carl gets a realtor who wants to be a reporter to actually write out an expose on the guru based on his property interests. Kolchak was employed by the Independent News Service, better known as the INS. On many occasions, Kolchak would misrepresent who he actually worked for. Immigration and Naturalization Service, Internal Revenue Service. Well, one time he did kind of claim to be the police commissioner, but we already talked about that. A lot of famous actors also portrayed monsters in the show. Richard Kyle was an actor who always portrayed huge characters, seeing as he stood 7'2". In the Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man, he played Canamet, an alien who shows up with this bizarre book in some unknown language. The experts managed to translate the title, which was To Serve Man. Hundreds of people volunteer to go back to Canamet's home planet. As the spaceship is about to leave, the experts manage to translate the rest of the book. It's a cookbook. If you never saw that episode, maybe you've heard of it. To Serve Man is a cookbook. Anyway, in Kolchak, Bad Medicine, Kyle plays the Diablero. A Native American legend materializes in Chicago, and Carl discovers it when he investigates the mysterious deaths of several wealthy socialites who have all been robbed of all of their jewelry. The murders increase, and Kolchak learns that the force at work, the Diablero, is a cursed Indian who has to roam the planet looking for valuable gems to create his treasure with. Tom Skerritt didn't so much portray a monster, but he did sell his soul to the devil in The Devil's Platform. He plays the part of Robert Palmer, who is a politician who is surrounded by a series of bizarre deaths and accidents that obliterate all of his opposition. Kolchak discovers Palmer has made a deal with the devil that affords him protection and allows him to change into a huge black dog in order to take care of his opponents. As the show went on and more people fell in love with both the stories and the character, the networks seemed to do their best to destroy it. At first, Kolchak was on Friday nights at 10 p.m., 9 o'clock Central. That's a hard time for a lot of people on the East Coast to be able to watch the show. Then they moved it to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, still on Friday nights. After a couple of months, they moved it to Saturdays. A Saturday is not a good time for any TV show because they have to compete with the movie of the week, as well as a lot of people not staying home on Saturday night. But hey, those TV executives, they know best. McGavin had signed on not only to play the lead role, but also as the executive producer, unpaid. He was working too many hours and not getting rich at it, and he was getting tired of both the extra work and the character he played. I guess he was tired of being Kolchak. The director was getting tired of arguing with McGavin, and the writers, they were getting tired of having to rewrite and then rewrite the script every time McGavin disagreed with what they were doing to Kolchak in the TV show. Kolchak only lasted 20 shows, but it was originally planned for 22 shows in the first season. McGavin demanded to be released from his contract, and the last two shows were never made. The cast all went on to do other things. Now, those of us who had watched every episode were at a loss. Our favorite TV show was no more. NBC sold the rights to CBS, who began showing Kolchak as a late night filler. They also did some weird things with 4 episodes. Firefall and The Energy Eater were combined to make one movie called Crackle of Death. Kolchak looks into several instances of spontaneous human combustion where the victims were suddenly incinerated as they slept. He finds reports of a conductor who spotted at the scenes of the crimes, which turns out to be a doppelganger. Also, at the same time, Kolchak faces a Native American monster known as a Machimoto. Machimoto. It's one of those words. Machimonido. Well, you watch the show and you'll hear how it's supposed to be pronounced. Well, even Kolchak can't pronounce it. William Smith has to do it for him. This is a giant invisible bear that causes electrical outbursts and deaths that all seem to be electrocutions all over this fancy new hospital that has just been opened. Those of us that were addicted to Kolchak watched this movie even though it didn't make much sense. It was kind of like fingernails on the chalkboard while drinking a fresh hot cup of coffee. You're enjoying it and not at the same time. The Demon and the Mummy was a combination of The Demon in Lace and The Legacy of Terror. The Demon in Lace was about an ancient stone tablet unearthed in the Middle East and brought back to the United States for study, and a deadly mystical force is unleashed. Kolchak follows a series of deaths where healthy young men were found dead of a heart attack, and there is a dead female with them, but the dead female has been dead a lot longer than the man has. Very strange, very mysterious. Carl discovers that he is dealing with a succubus. Carolyn Jones is the woman played Morticia, plays the school registrar. It was kind of neat to sit there and watch the shows and try to pick out all the celebrities that you knew from other TV shows. There were a lot of them. The Mummy was originally called The Legacy of Terror. A series of brutal murders all share a particularly grisly characteristic. Each victim has his or her heart cut out, like a human sacrifice, and they're all found at locations where there are stairs. Kolchak discovers that the murders are all connected to a modern-day Aztec cult that is trying to bring on the apocalypse. Eric Estrada, the guy from Chips, plays Pepe Torres, soon to be a sacrificial victim. The thing about the Aztec sacrifices, they were willing to be sacrificed because they were going to live with the gods. They didn't have to hold them down while they're cutting out their hearts. They simply drugged them up a bit and then had at it. The stories were mixed together in an attempt to make one, and then McGavin did some voiceovers to try to fix the continuity, but it didn't work. I still watched the 4 movies just because. the fourth movie. CBS would have been far better off had they simply run the two shows back to back and instead of trying to intermix them. The legacy of Kolchak, the Night Stalker, are many. To begin with, a lot of actors got their starts portraying small parts in the show. Chris Carter, the creator of The X-Files, got his inspiration watching Kolchak as he grew up. Darren McGavin played the retired FBI agent Arthur Dales in The X-Files. He was going to portray Carl Kolchak, but due to copyright, they couldn't use that name, so they had to change him to a retired FBI agent. In the remake of The X-Files, Mulder and Scully meet the Were-Monster. Rice Darby plays Guy Mann. What a name. Guy Mann. His outfit was designed to pay homage to Carl Kolchak. The only thing missing were the camera and the tape recorder hanging from his shoulder. Other than that, it was Kolchak's suit. Now, I have all 20 episodes of Kolchak the Night Stalker on DVD, and I do watch them from time to time. I've been trying to find a straw hat and a cheap white suit with blue stripes on it to create my own Halloween costume, but so far I haven't found what I'm looking for. Someday I just might be able to dress up like Kolchak when I'm handing out candy to the kids. Another legacy of the TV show is what you're listening to right now. I doubt if Strange Things would have become a podcast had I not watched Kolchak all those years ago. It was what got me interested in all things paranormal and strange. This led to me writing the LPRS book, which got me in contact with Arturo, who conned me into doing that first podcast, 363 episodes ago. So, we have Kolchak the Night Stalker to thank for a lot of our entertainment today. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, let the folks you know what they're missing. If you didn't enjoy the show, what the heck are you doing listening to me talk for over an hour? Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?